Ethnobotany, so did I get that correct? Yes. Okay. So, and then too, just for the students here, just a couple of things you were handed out. One is an evaluation. We hand out evaluations to students to kind of get feedback on our programming and the type of experiences that we're providing for you. And then the second is a membership application for DUSCI, to become a member of DUSCI. There's no charge, but certainly membership in DUSCI is a prerequisite for participating in Dukers as well as the summer research program. And once you become a member, you get informed of all the neat and cool things that we are doing. So thank you, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ross.
Okay, greetings everybody. So I'm feeling a bit like a flibbertigibbet right now because I just got out of teaching lab and my head is all over the place. So if I talk really fast and you have no idea what I'm talking about, somebody just go, that would help out. So, ethnobotany, this is what I do. And ethnobotany is basically my short on the airplane when I tell somebody who says, you do what? Is that it's basically a blend of plant biology and anthropology. So ethnobotany is the science that studies the relationship between humans and plants. Plant communities, could be individual species, it's any and everything that would relate in that realm. But when you think about it, I said, okay, what's your relationship with plants? What do you think most people would say? Things you eat is probably the most common one, right? Because we eat lots of plants. And food is, of course, in agriculture, this is one of the most common things that ethnobotanists study and the development of agriculture throughout history. But ethnobotany encompasses actually a lot more than that. So when you think about the interrelationship between humans and plants, this includes everything from the food we eat, to the clothes we wear, to the air we breathe, and to the sensation you get when you step outside, when you go on vacation to the Rocky Mountains, and you look out and you see that beautiful vista of pine trees. That is part of it, because your perceptions of nature affect how you interact with nature and how you manage nature. And that then is reflected in the ecology of your impact. It has an ecological impact on the plant community itself, which then reflects back on your perceptions. And so there's this reciprocal relationship. And so when we talk about ethnobotany, it is a collection of both the natural and the social sciences. So I've right at that interface. And I got interested in this when I was an undergrad, actually, at the University of Nebraska. I started out as a history major. And I was interested in herbals, which were books written, most of them, most familiar ones, would be written during the medieval period. And these were books which were mostly a collection of plants used for medicines. They had recipes for what medicines to make, but they also included a lot of cultural folklore and other ideas about, for example, poppy should be collected at night and when you're tied to a dog. I have no idea why, but that was important. So there's a lot of culture mixed into there, and I got very interested in that. So I decided to take a botany class in order to sort of get a bit of a better understanding about the plants themselves, and I loved it. Got totally hooked and switched over and got my BS in biology. But my interest in that human-plant relationship remained, and I carried that into my PhD at the University of Connecticut. So for my PhD, I studied a Native American culture called the Maya, who I am sure you've heard about if you haven't seen that Mel Gibson movie, 2012. So this is it. Good thing you're listening to me now, because we're all going to die soon. But the Maya were the dominant culture in Central America for about 3,000 years. So starting around 2000 BC is when they established those major urban centers that tourists like to go visit, like Tikal. And so from about 2000 BC up until about 1000 AD, they spread throughout all of Mesoamerica and established a lot of these major urban centers. And there are estimates of population up to 15 million people. So they were a hugely powerful force on the system. And the archaeological evidence that we have is that they had a very strong relationship with the trees, obviously, because they're a culture that grew up in a tropical forest. And so they made use of an enormous variety of tree species. So here is an example. This is a tree species that some of you Not a mango.
Chocolate?
Yes, this is a chocolate tree. Chocolate is native to Mesoamerica. And so they had this very strong relationship, and in their urban centers, in the residential areas, they would build gardens that were mostly tree-dominated, that pretty strongly replicated the structure of the natural forest. But, like I said, 1,000 years ago, culture collapsed. More than 90% of the people died, and they abandoned pretty much all of these urban centers. And so it's been 1,000 years since anyone really has been having much activity in a lot of these areas of forest. And so what I'm interested in is that I was reading a paper by a Mexican ecologist and conservation biologist who said that much of the Mesoamerican forest is basically just a big feral garden. And I thought, wow, I wonder if that's true. I wonder if, even after 1,000 years, you could still detect the impact of these Maya tree gardens. And so that's what I went to check out. So I went and I worked on the Belize-Guatemala border at an archaeological site called El Pilar. And at El Pilar, this was abandoned around, like I said, 1,000 years ago. Has not been resettled since. And so I looked at about 7,000 trees in 63 plots. And about half of these were in these ancient residential areas. And the other half of these are in a similar forest that was outside of the urban center, and it was not part of these ancient residential areas. And what I found was, despite 1,000 years where people have not been managing this land, there was still a very strong signal in the species composition of the Maya forest gardens. So when I ran a test known as an indicator species analysis, this is a test which will tell you statistically significant indicator species for your a priori defined groups. In my case, the residential versus non-residential forest areas. And I found that this big difference in species composition is actually being driven by a differential abundance of these useful species that the Maya were managing in these gardens. There was a much higher abundance of them in and around these ancient residential areas. And in fact, a lot of the noxious species, there's a species in the area called black poisonwood, which is kind of like poison ivy on steroids. And if you even get near the tree, some people can blow up with an allergic reaction and can't breathe and die. So it's pretty nasty. And in fact, in these residential areas, there wasn't any black poisonwood. It was completely eradicated from these regions. Whereas, 5 kilometers away, there's plenty of it. So there was a really strong impact of the Maya even after thousands of years. So this really, gave me the bug about just this fascinating interaction between humans as part of an ecosystem and how they can lead to these differential effects over time. And so I've carried this on into the research that I do now, which is in the Himalaya, hence the reason, the topic that you guys all came to see. I work primarily here in China, but I also do some work in Nepal and a bit in Tibet and Bhutan and otherwise. But for the most part, most of the work that I'm going to talk about today is my work in China. And the Himalaya, they are the highest mountains in the world, at least twice as high as the Rockies. And not only are they enormously, they have this enormously complex topography, they are also the home of a huge diversity of species. In fact, it's the most biologically diverse temperate ecosystem on the planet. And the vast majority of this diversity is driven by plant diversity. Animal diversity is pretty much the same as in North America. And so this high diversity has actually led this region of the world to be labeled a hotspot. Now, a hotspot is an area of high diversity that is highly threatened by development, land use change, and the more recent problems of climate change. But not only is this area a hotspot of biological diversity, it is also a hotspot of cultural diversity. 25 of the 55 recognized minority ethnic groups in China call this area of the eastern Himalayas home. And so these people depend very heavily on the plant species in this mountain environment. And so when these mountain species are threatened, so are cultures in the area. Now, what's most distinctive is the extreme elevational gradients that you encounter when you go to the Himalaya. I mean, if you just think about going to the Rockies, all the hiking you do in the Rockies, imagine doing twice that much every time you go up and down. So it's extremely powerful, a 2,000 to 7,000 meter difference as you walk through an area. And so this is providing an enormous number of habitats for this wide diversity of species. And the local people, when we talk to them about our censuses of the species at these various, along these environmental gradients, we talk to them about, well, you know, what are the species that you recognize? What are the species that you make use of? And how do you manage species? And so there's a lot of information that they can provide because they have a wealth of knowledge. Their culture has been there for thousands of years. They have a lot of knowledge about the species here, how they're used, how they grow, what species grow together, what species don't grow together, where they grow, all sorts of things. Really fascinating stuff. So we spoke a lot with the local people about these various environmental gradients. And so when we compiled our data on the species themselves, what we found was that as you move along the environmental gradient from the bottom of the mountain, pretty much about 2,000 meters, up to the highest peak areas where plants grow, you're not usually getting too many plants at 7,000 meters when it's permanently frozen. So they usually stop around 5,000. And so if we look along that gradient, what we discovered was that the highest species diversity and species richness were both found in the alpine. The alpine is the zone above the tree line, where it's too cold and the soil is too thin to hold trees. And not only was the species richness and diversity highest there, but the useful species diversity and richness was also highest in the alpine. More than 60% of alpine species are medicinal and culturally important species. Unfortunately, the alpine is also where the most extreme environments tend to react badly to a lot of perturbations. And the alpine is an area that is having the biggest impact from climate change. The Himalaya, because of the fact that it is so high, is actually experiencing a faster rate of climate change than anywhere else in the world except for the Arctic. And so these species that are evolved to live in this very cold-dominated species are struggling to stay in a habitat that they recognize. And so they're having to move farther and farther up the mountain. Not only that, but they're experiencing competition from species that never could survive there before. Like we actually ran into dandelion there recently, which is not supposed to be there. But it's moving in because it's warmer now. And they aren't such great competitors. They're good at living in terrible environments, but they're not so great at duking it out with somebody else. So they're moving higher and higher up the mountains. Well, eventually you're going to get the escalator effect, where basically they're just going to get popped off the top of the mountain and run out of available habitat. So this is threatening both the biological and the cultural diversity of this area. Hence, ethnobotanists come. So in order to really get a handle on this, we knew that we had to have a really strong baseline ecological data on what was going on in the area. Previous research has already established that the most powerful environmental gradient for looking at species composition is elevation, which is pretty straightforward. You would assume that, right? Precipitation has also been suggested to be a very strong gradient in terms of changes in species composition, so we want to look at that. But one thing that has not really been looked at before was potential in biogeographic effects. So this area of China is in the province of Yunnan, and in northwest Yunnan, you will note it is dissected by 3 major river gorges. 3 of the 5 major rivers that go through Asia all originate right here at the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. And so they run parallel through this area. So we've got the Yangtze, the Mekong, and the Salween rivers all moving through this area, these huge river gorges. So what is the effect of this in terms of its biogeographic effects on plant species distributions? So that's what we wanted to check out. Now, in order to do this, we actually joined a global network called GLORIA, which I always forget what that stands for, so I have to read it. Global Observation Research Initiative in Alpine Environments. So this is a worldwide network of climate change scientists, and so we are looking to track effects of climate change in all areas of the world. And the alpine is the perfect habitat in which to do this, because it is the only ecosystem which is found at all latitudes. And so you can actually track these climate-induced changes along all of the fundamental climatic gradients in a worldwide scale. So this is what we work as part of. Now, if you have a global network, then you have to make sure that everybody's doing the same thing everywhere to make your data comparable, right? So, and this was designed by Germans, so it's very rigorous. It's, you know, there's a lot about it. So, to do this, for every site, you start out by identifying 4 peaks within your site. And those peaks range from just above tree line, so the low alpine, to just below permanent snow line, so stretching all throughout the entire alpine. Now each of those peaks, starting from the summit, move down in all 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. You go down 5 vertical meters. And you cordon off the top, the summit. And so what you have there is 4 summit sections now. Then from 5 vertical meters, you go down another 5 vertical meters, and you have 4 more summit sections. All right, those are all then divided in half. And in each summit section, then we do a relevé, where we look at species composition and relative abundance. All right, now you also note these quadrat clusters at the 5 vertical meter mark. I'll mention what those are in just a second. So here it is in action. This is the summit peak, and you can see all of our lines going down the mountain. And this is looking from 10 vertical meters back up towards the summit. And so what you can see, possibly right up here, is one of those quadrat clusters. So these quadrat clusters are a set of 9 1-meter squared quadrats, where we do extensive vegetation sampling. And so in each one of these corner quadrats, you do actually look at both frequency and abundance for all species that are present in the area. And then in the center of the 3x3 quadrat cluster, you're going to bury a temperature monitor. And that temperature monitor then will measure the temperature every hour for between 5 and 10 years, depending on the weather. If the weather's really bad, it runs the battery out faster. So you have to go back and make sure the battery's still running every once in a while. So as you might imagine, you're going to run into a lot of different environments in these things. So sometimes you get this really lovely meadow where it makes it really easy to measure all the plants, but then other times you have this unfortunate situation where we had to pull the snow off very carefully to try to get a look at all of our plants. So we had a big snowstorm right before I went out that day. And so there is an example of one of our temperature monitors buried in the ground. They're wireless, so that once we get close enough, you get within about 10 meters, you can detect it with a wireless signal, and so then you can find it and dig it up again in 10 years. And we also do extensive photography, so that when we come back, we can reset everything up in exactly the same place and recensus. And then once we dig up the temperature monitor, we now can look at our new data from the 10-year mark and compare it with changes in temperature over time. And then we voucher the heck out of everything, drinking tons and tons and tons of ginger tea, which by the time this sits on the stove for like 10 hours or something, it's like peeling the enamel off of your teeth. It's amazing. There's just huge chunks of ginger thrown in water and boiled for hours. It's delicious, but a little bit crazy. Okay, so how does this all fit together? Well, previous research before this year, there had been 3 sites throughout Northwest Yunnan that had been included in the Yunnan Gloria network. And so they actually conveniently helped us to test our questions about precipitation gradients, because the monsoon moves in from the southwest to the northeast, such that Site C has the highest rainfall, Site A has the lowest rainfall, and B is intermediate. So in order to test whether there was much of it, whether precipitation gradient was going to have a strong effect on species composition, we decided to establish a second site in the intermediate zone to see how it related in species composition with the other intermediate site in relation to the other 2. And this site is it's the Meli Mountains. And now the Meli Mountains are the home of Mount Coagabo. And Coagabo is the home of the god of thunder. It's a highly sacred mountain. And so the land is managed by the local people in order to preserve it, because they're very, very careful to maintain the system around here. So it helps, so we didn't have to fight our way through a lot of yaks. As you might guess, amazing number of gloriously beautiful plant species. Even though they're only this tall, they're rather delightful once you take a look at them up close. And so we found our 4 peaks ranging from around 4,500 to 4,900 meters. And so we found a total of 103 species from 29 different families. And this fellow here is the key to a lot of the work we do in China. This is Feng Zhendong, who is the director of the Shangri-La Alpine Botanic Garden. And he's an amazing field botanist. And he's also the guy who's sort of holding up Gloria China together, because we're over here in the US and we've got to hold everything together when we're over there. So he's a pretty amazing guy. Okay, so we have a species composition. What is it going to tell us? So we ran this using an ordination. The ordination that we decided on was a canonical correspondence analysis. This is a direct gradient analysis. So what this means is that we can directly compare environmental gradients with species composition and your a priori defined groups, our regions, region A, B, and C. And what you can see here is that they do separate out pretty cleanly along 2 different axes. So if I could make these big enough so you could see it, you would notice that these are, in fact, these plots, these dots that are on this side, those are the plots that are at the lower elevation. So these lower peaks in our group, and these are our higher peaks. So when we looked at that, we actually see a really strong environmental correlation. That environmental gradient of elevation is pretty much all of axis 1 is composed of elevation. Now, interestingly, we also see is that there is a very strong precipitation gradient. You can see that A, B, and C do separate out along axis 2 as well, along the precipitation gradient. So precipitation also has very strong environmental correlation here as well, 0.7. And so precipitation is explaining the vast majority of what's going on along axis 2 as well. But you also see, so at this regional level, these 2 intermediate sites with equivalent precipitation seem to ordinate together. They seem to be the same in terms of their species composition. However, when we take this and look at this at the local level, the environmental gradients are no longer relevant because these guys are at the same level. But what we see is that species compositions of site B1 and site B2 are clearly different from one another. So what's going on with this situation? Well, when we first established this, remember the second thing that we were questioning was that biogeographic effect of those major river gorges. And so site B1, the original site, was over here on the east side of the Mekong Gorge. So when we established our second site in Meili, we put it on the west side, less than 20 kilometers distant. So equivalent precipitation. And remember that everybody pretty much has equivalent environmental because that's how the whole system works. So what we found is they have these different species compositions, and when I ran an indicator species analysis, if you remember, it was a test to look for significant indicator species that would indicate a specific group that you defined ahead of time. What I found was that many of the significant indicator species, more than half of them, were from shared genera. And so as you can see, for example, Gentiana, the genus, on site B1, Gentiana tutsiensis, but in site B2, Gentiana wardii. So they're sister species, which means that they're evolutionarily very, very closely related to one another, but they are separated out by this river valley. And so what this is telling us is that, yes, the major regional scale drivers of the species composition that is precipitation and elevation. But when you look at the local level, there are these strong biogeographic forces, which is leading to this high beta diversity that is found in this area of the world. And this high beta diversity is suggested by our data is actually being driven by increased endemism, because there is potentially these river valleys are functioning as a pollination or a dispersal barrier to the species there. So we have basically species unable to share DNA with one another across the river because they can't get their DNA on the other side of the river. So they're actually working on separate evolutionary tracks. So we're getting actual speciation. So this might explain the extremely high rate of endemism found in this area of the world, and why perhaps this area is the most biologically diverse area of the world. And so this is our crew from Gloria Yunnan crew. We had terrible weather. It was like this every day. It was terrible. So you have to give them credit for actually sticking with us. They were probably like, why are we doing this? But it was good. So this leads me, so this was really great, a lot of success, but as we were moving into this area, like I said, remember this is a sacred area, not much agriculture or anything else going on, but in order to get there we had to hike through a whole lot of yak meadows. And what I noticed when I was hiking through those yak meadows there were these hummock plants, which is a type of rhododendron. Rhododendrons are native to this area. So all the rhododendrons that your mom grows, they're from here. And so these rhododendrons up in the mountains, when I noticed I was walking through these meadows, I would occasionally see flowers poking out of these little rhododendron hummocks. And I started to wonder. Now rhododendrons, how many of you guys have seen the first Sherlock Holmes film? Yeah? Do you remember when he poisoned the dog at the beginning of the movie? He poisoned the dog using rhododendron leaves. Rhododendron is highly toxic. And so the yak won't eat it. And I started to wonder if maybe these other plants that were sort of hiding out inside of the rhododendrons were actually making use of the rhododendrons as some sort of grazing shield. And so the question was, do the yaks and the yak grazing these areas, are they actually affecting the species distributions of the other forbs in this area? And which, again, this has a lot of meaning for the local people as well, because most of these forbs have medicinal purpose. And so does this affect how these people manage the land and manage the yaks themselves? And so I talked to the herders, the yak herders from the area. They spend more time up there than anybody else as they're sitting there just watching their yaks eat all day and looking around. And so I talked to them about how they perceive where certain species live in the meadows. And so through these conversations, and they actually drew me some maps showing how these plants relate to one another spatially throughout the meadows. And whether this affects how they collect their medicinal plants when they're up there. So there's a lot of information, and this is what I just did this past summer. So I don't have an answer for this one, so I'm just throwing it out there. But we got a lot of really great information. What I did find, however, was that when I looked at species compositions just on the edges of these rhododendron hummocks and then out in the meadow proper, highly significant difference in species composition. There is a unique community of plants that live their whole lives clustered around the edges of these rhododendron hummocks. And so you can kind of see from this giant mess of color here, see these blue triangles here. This is the edge community. So you can see that the edge community is separating itself out, but the rest of them is just total chaos, and it's hard to see. So we have been decided, okay, what else could be part of this picture? Perhaps there's differential reproductive success by different species, whether they're in the edge or outside of, or in the meadow. Perhaps there are seasonal fluctuations. So I was just up there in the summer for about a month and a half. And so we're planning on going back and looking at this at different times throughout the growing season to see if perhaps this community might actually change throughout the growing season. So there's still a lot of work that we're doing in this area. But we do see that there are certain species, for example, this brassica, this little mustard here, that are 100% found just in those little hummocks of rhododendron. So there is something going on here. And that's it. That's me. So I'd be happy to get any questions.
So how do you factor in the effect that bugs and other creatures have on plant evolution?
Well, we don't have too much trouble with herbivory up there because it's so cold. There are very few insect species out there. There are bees. So like, for example, rhododendron or too much trouble with insects.
But what about bees? I guess, I mean, when you were talking about the two different vegetations that live on opposite sides of the, the river,
Oh,
and
you're
that
wondering-
being like 10 miles apart, and so the river being something that's keeping them apart, but aren't there other factors that could maybe, I don't know, like you hear about a shortage of bees or bees dying off, and so is that a phenomenon that's happening everywhere, and is that contributing to some of the changes that you're observing?
I guess it's possible. I don't know if they're having a bee shortage in the Himalayas. So that I don't know about if there has been a change. I haven't heard anything or haven't read anything about there being an issue with pollinator limitations in the Himalaya. But yeah, there are all sorts of reasons why this could function as a barrier. We're not actually sure why, so that's something we're going to have to pursue in the future as well. So is it a barrier to pollination? Is it a barrier to seed dispersal? We're not really clear what could be driving that separation.
Is it possible from an evolutionary standpoint to kind of date back where this split in species occurred between B1 and B2?
I think so. I think that we should at least be able to get a look at it. So we do have vouchers, like I said, from all of these, and so we have started to do genotyping to look at these things. To look at some of our vouchers are still in China, so we're sort of working with the Kunming Institute of Botany to get that data put together. So, but yeah, we have started to look and see if we can see any difference in genetic diversity amongst these different populations. Because yeah, that's a really good question.
Is there some baseline records of the flora of that area that you use, or are you using your initial surveys as baseline?
Well, we're using our initial surveys as a baseline because while there were people like Joseph Rock, for example, Joseph Rock spent a lot of time in the Midi area. He was a famous Himalayan explorer and mountain climber back in the day, back in like the 20s, I think. But he didn't do extensive surveying. I mean, he did a lot of vouchering to identify species that were there. So, it's very helpful to know what species we think we're going to encounter. But we don't have a really regimented census to know what a relative abundance is, for example. So yeah, we're using our data as the baseline.
Back to the Himalayas, was Broseum malcastrum one of those indicator trees?
Broseum was not.
Oh, really?
I know.
And
This is.
Stevens and Cathaway, when they are incidents of traveling in Yucatan, they would encounter Broseum malcastrum.
Yes, Broseum is a tree in the tropical forest which produces a fruit which is kind of like a nut, and it's highly nutritious. And so it was an argument by a lot of people that perhaps the Maya made extensive use of this species, and there is some evidence that they did make use of this species. But in fact, my data did not show that to be the case, and there has been a lot of studies on Broseum and its relationship. Most of the time, they're finding this high abundance of Broseum around these, but they're around the urban center, around the monumental zone, not in the residential areas.
Yeah, I worked with Dennis Pilston
Oh, did you?
in Belize in 1973 in New York. He did his dissertation on it.
Yes.
He called with the Cheltoons and the occupied areas, contemporarily occupied areas.
Yeah.
It was a compelling argument.
Yeah, I mean, it really was. And but what they've discovered is that around a lot of these monumental areas, bats live there, and bats eat the fruits and poop them out right there. And so it seems that basically 1,000 years of bat poop has led to a really high amount of Broseum growing where the bats live in these areas. So out in the forest, when you're in where there was residential areas, the houses were both made out of wood, so there aren't any out there anymore. All you can tell is just little platforms out in, hummocks in the dirt, basically. And so out there, we're not actually seeing a difference in Broseum.
Going back to your comparison of B1 and B2, so I think it was B2 was the cultured area. Have you looked at, or somewhat cultured?
No, they were both B1 and B2 are sort of, it's the god lives there and you leave it
And
be.
B1 is pretty much untouched, but for different reasons.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a variety, there's a big lot of land up there.
And see,
Oh, sorry.
the rhododendron and the yak, are those in their kind of original distributions? That is, are they introduced into that? Well, one idea is, are the yaks helping the rhododendrons grow
I see what you're saying.
by grazing or defecating or whatever they do to fertilize? Or, so the question is, why are the rhododendrons so toxic? You know,
So the yaks won't.
Well, I'm sorry?
So the yaks won't eat them.
but is it the yaks, or the yaks introduced later into this region?
The yaks were not introduced later. They are native, but there are more yaks than there used to be.
Yeah.
And there are a lot more yak cow hybrids because they produce more milk.
Yeah.
But the higher you get in the mountains, the less cow per yak, and because they can't survive very well when it gets cold. So this high, yeah. I'll have to tell you about my experience with yak cheese at some point. But there are more yaks in some of these grazing areas than there used to be, which is another reason why, one of the things I talked to the herders about, and they did comment that the rhododendron, while they've always been there, there's also some juniper in these things that the yaks don't eat as well. And even one of the herders even said to me, the only thing protecting the meadows are the rhododendrons and the junipers, because they're providing these other plants, which are suddenly, because of this increase in yak populations in recent years, they're starting to see, a pressure on these populations of useful species, and they're finding that the rhododendrons and the junipers are sort of keeping the populations safe to some extent, or maintaining some of them anyway. But they aren't necessarily being introduced. They are native to the area. The rhododendrons are native. And they grow so slowly that, and with the increase in yak, I don't know if we actually noticed for a long period of time whether they're really extensively increasing their abundance or not. But it's a good point.
Have you seen indications of climate change effects?
Oh, yeah. Quite a bit in changes in species composition and increase in southern species just in terms of the plants. But you also see, for example, the people in the area are noticing that used to be, you'd make up your food and just leave it because, during the day it's 35, so it's not exactly toasty warm up there because it's so high. And so it wasn't a problem having food go bad. Well, suddenly their food is starting to go bad, and they don't have refrigeration, of course. Why would they? Another thing they never encountered before was mosquitoes. But suddenly it's warm enough for the mosquitoes to come up, and so malaria has moved in from some of the areas, which is something they don't have any protection against. So there's a lot of other diseases that they've been having trouble with because of bad food and mosquito-borne illnesses and things like that. So they've been sort of, having a lot of struggles. And then, of course, not climate change, but just land use change in general, like with development. They used to just, do a lot of yak herding and some farming of high elevation crops like buckwheat. But now, of course, they can actually grow rice in some of these areas. And rice is much more low elevation species, but it's gotten warm enough that they can grow rice in some of these areas. And then they, now don't get this, now these people have a lot of trouble, but don't think that they're just, victimized either. So there's, for example, when the French missionaries first showed up in the area, they built this little, little church with a big stone wall, really high stone wall, and they planted grapes because they were French and they wanted wine. So they, for a long time, they took care of these things in this very protected little microenvironment. Well, it's gotten warm in the area. The missionaries are not there any longer, but then the native Tibetans in the area found this mission with a bunch of grapes, and they thought, oh, let's give it a shot. And they started planting it around, and they survived. And they have not only survived, they've excelled. They've won some major global competitions in ice wines. We got a little bottle of ice wine, which is unlabeled, for $90 for this big. And if it had been labeled, it would have been a couple $100. So it's kind of amazing. So they're doing, they have lots of ingenuity.